Cody Martin. This is Morris Walton, Roger Enlow. We're on the board of the Bridge Street History Center, and we're here at the Bridge Street History Center in Granbury, Texas today. It's April of 2024. This is the 150th year anniversary of the hanging of Cooney Mitchell. It was the only legal hanging ever conducted in Hood County. This book, Outlaw, by C.L. Shaughnessy, details the feud that led up to the hanging and the subsequent events. What we're going to do today is we're going to visit some of the sites that are mentioned in this book, some of the local sites where events occurred, and so folks can see where this stuff actually happened. Now, Roger is going to give us just a brief introduction to the feud and what we're going to be doing.
The Mitchell-Truitt Feud was a deadly clash between two Texas families in the 1870s. A land dispute sparked the conflict, leading to a trial, shootings, and the hanging of Cooney Mitchell. His son, Bill, sought revenge by killing Jim Truitt, forcing him to live as an outlaw for 30 years. Bill's constant flight from the law ended in his capture. C.L. Shaughnessy book, Outlaw, delves into this captivating story of frontier justice and the life of an outlaw on the run. Through extensive interviews and research, he paints a vivid picture of the trials, shootout, and hanging of Cooney Mitchell, as well as the struggles of his son, Bill, a man seeking normalcy while constantly hunted by the law.
Here we are on the Granbury Town Square. This site is significant because this is where the trial between when the Mitchell pursued the Truitts, the first trial, which was a result of the feud for money owed. What would have been here in those days, the current courthouse was not here. It was constructed in the 1890s. So in 1875, there would have been a log courthouse, and the buildings you see around the square today would not have been here. There were probably some log structures or maybe wooden buildings because the town was just beginning to get started. But the first trial occurred here, and Roger's going to tell us about that now.
By the beginning of 1874, and probably for some time before, all friendly discussion between the families had been broken off. The bad feeling had mounted so high that the boys had had what the elder Mitchell called personal encounters. There must have been taunts and bitter words which could not be forgiven, and the showdown may have been near more than once. It finally arrived on a Saturday, March 28, 1874, after a court session in Granbury. Nelson Mitchell was suing P.M. Truitt for money he said Truitt owed, in which Truitt said he did not owe. The trial had been going on with interruptions all week, and there had been much conflicting testimony.
We're here on Contrary Creek Road. Mr. David Cleveland is going to tell us about what happened here that was pertinent to the Cooney Mitchell story. David?
This is the crossing called Contrary Creek, about 7 miles from Granbury. And if you're leaving in 1874, if you left Granbury headed to Mitchell Bend, this was the first water hole you could come to water your horses. And on this day in March the 28th in 1874, the Mitchells and the Truitts headed out of Granbury to Mitchell Bend, and they were coming down this trail, headed and riding close together. And there were some very ill feelings between the two families, and they argued pretty much all the way down here. And Mr. Mitchell, Cooney Mitchell, he and a couple of his neighbors were coming behind them in a wagon. Bill Mitchell and one of their employees named Mint Graves was ahead of them, and ahead of the Bill Mitchell and their Graves local Truitt boys. There were 3 of them. James Truitt was a preacher, Methodist preacher, and there was Sam, and then there was Isaac. Isaac was a 17-year-old boy, and they called it Delight. So they were in the lead, and they come down and they stopped here to water the horses. The Truitts got here first, and they pulled down here to the creek and started watering their animals, and Bill Mitchell and Mint Graves come up, but they didn't come down. They waited till they got their horses watered, and they started on down the road a little ways, so they came on down to water their horses. And by this time, Cooney Mitchell and his son-in-law and his neighbor that were with him came up, and they were inside of the two groups. And this is where the story gets kind of fuzzy. There's two different tales about what happened next. But there were shots fired as they were here around this creek. Nobody knows who fired the first shot or one. They was the both was only just started shooting. But when the shooting was over, that boy, Sam, was laying dead, shot with a shotgun. And little like 17-year-old boy was also dead. James, the Methodist preacher, had been shot with a shotgun in his shoulder. He managed to go on down the road to a farmhouse and get some aid from those people. They brought him in this house and laid him in the floor and did what they could for him. And the story is that as long as that house stood, there were bloodstains on the floor where he lay. But when the shooting was over, Bill Mitchell and Mick Graves headed west. They were getting as far away from Hood County as they could get. And Cooney and his son-in-law and his neighbor rode up in the wagon. They looked the situation over, saw that there had been what had happened. They had not been involved in it at all. They were just had heard the shots and saw the gun smoke, but they didn't see the actual shootings. So they decided they'd just go on home. They hadn't been involved with anything and weren't looking for the law to come after them, so they went on home. But the next day, the sheriff come down and arrested all three of them and put them into Hood County Jail. And Bill Mitchell went all the way to New Mexico, stayed out there for years. He was a fugitive, and finally, in about the early 1900s, I think it was, he was arrested and brought back to Hood County.
Here we are. We're still located at the Granbury Courthouse. The log cabin that would have stood where the current courthouse is where the trial of Cooney Mitchell occurred that resulted in his hanging, and Roger's going to tell us about that now.
It was really Judge Seward who tied the noose around Cooney Mitchell's neck. When all the testimony was in and the prosecution had finished with its case, the judge read a lengthy charge to the jury. He defined murder and manslaughter. He discussed the meaning of sudden passion and its application in cases of murder. The jury could have no doubt about the matter after such a charge. If they really believed, and they did believe, that Nelson Mitchell actually said those fatal words, "Give 'em hell, boys," their duty was clear. They presented their unanimous verdict as follows. We, the jury, find the defendant, Nelson Mitchell, guilty of murder in the first degree and assess his punishment as death. The judge sentenced him to hang.
We're located on a bluff a little south of the Granbury Town Square. This site is significant to the Cooney Mitchell story because Jeff Mitchell, Cooney's son, the day or two before Cooney was to be hung, Jeff was attempting to smuggle pistols and poison to Cooney. The pistols were to be used in an attempted escape, and if that failed, Cooney was going to take the poison and cheat the hangman. You can see in the background, we've got Lake Granbury. This would have been the Brazos River, of course, in 1875. And in the shooting where Jeff was shot attempting to bring these things to the jail is what Roger's going to tell us about now.
The old jailhouse is gone now, and only a vacant, weed-grown lot is left. But in 1875, it stood up tall and solid on the north brink of the bluff which overlooked the Brazos Bottom. A 30-foot slope of limestone rock, overgrown with bushes and weeds, fell away to the flat land below, where scattered trees gave some cover. The window of Cooney's cell looked out across this slope and the river bottom in the direction of Mitchell's Bend. Jeff's plan was to ford the river at night, tie his horse in the brush, crawl up the bluff, and make his contact. His father was to be ready with a string hanging out the window, to which Jeff would attach his package. At the first opportunity, Cooney would pull it up and go on as best as he could from there.
We're still located at the site of where the jail was located that Cooney was kept in. I was visiting here several years ago with the property owner, and he pointed out the location of this well pump. He said this was the location of the actual well that served the jail, which was actually just a shack. It was right to my left there. One of the interesting things about that whole story to me is that the night that Jeff was shot, trying to get the guns or the laudanum to Cooney was about a day or two before Cooney was actually hung. So he got the news about his son being shot a day or two before he was hung. So you can imagine just what was going through his mind, not only his imminent death, but the announcement that his son had just been killed trying to get to him.
Here we are at the Lambert Branch Park, a little bit north of the town of Granbury. No one knows exactly where the hanging took place, but we're in the vicinity. We know it was somewhere near this. We know it was a little bit north of the town, and it was near the railroad tracks. There are some folks who say it may have been a little closer toward the reunion ground, which would be a little east of us, but we know we're in the area. Roger's now going to read to us and tell us about the actual hanging of Cooney Mitchell.
This was in the short hours of Wednesday morning, October 7th, 1875. The execution was set for Friday. The days and nights which intervened were dreadful indeed for Nelson Mitchell. He took Jeff's death harder than the prospect of his own. The Texas papers, still unsympathetic toward the Mitchells, pictured him as raving in his cell and calling down the wrath of God on everybody who contributed to his mercy. Wednesday night, said the San Antonio Herald for October 16th, he made several attempts to commit suicide by hanging himself with a chain which he had wrenched from the door, but his heart failed him. He spent the night in cursing the sheriff and officers. Thursday night, a guard was placed in his cell to prevent self-destruction. Friday morning found him still alive, but not for long. The preparations for his execution had been completed. Sheriff Wright and his deputies had erected a gallows on the northern outskirts of the town. They had a coffin ready. About the middle of the morning, they drove around to the jail in a farm wagon to pick up the prisoner and take him to his death. A great crowd had gathered about the gallows, hundreds of people. The papers declared that 5,000 spectators were present, but such a number would have depopulated the country for 50 miles around. It would have been more accurate to say that all the able-bodied citizens who could get there, from small boys to old men, were on the ground. If you were around there, Cody, would you have gone?
I would have.
It was a nervous assembly. The rumor still went around that the Mitchells might come charging up at any minute, guns blazing in all directions. At one point during the waiting, the word spread that they were actually entering the town, and part of the crowd broke and ran across the railroad to the hitching racks where they had tied their horses. When no Mitchells showed up, they drifted sheepishly back and resumed their waiting. Back at the jail, they were leading Nelson Mitchell out and seating him on his own coffin in the wagon. By now, he had regained his nerve, if he had ever lost it, and one would like to think he hadn't. He kept his head up as he rode and observed the gathering of friends and foes with an indomitable eye. The old folk story is told of him as it has been told of many others in his situation. As a group of cowboys hurried past the wagon, intent on getting a good place to observe the proceedings, he called out, "Don't hurry, boys. Nothing can happen till I get there." The wagon pulled up under the gallows, and Sheriff Wright put a rope around Nelson Mitchell's wrinkled neck. Then he asked him if he had anything to say. "Yes, I have," said Mitchell, and proceeded to say it. No stenographer took down minutes of his remarks, but the people of Granbury have not forgotten his last words. He stood up in the wagon, a thin, dried-up old man with a long white beard and white hair hanging down to his shoulders, and made what the historian of Hood County called prostration to the crowd. He told them that he had always been known as an honest man who paid his debts, and TTU, the historian, admitted that he bore the reputation for honesty among all who knew him best. He didn't say much about the crime of which he was accused, but he talked about the death of young Jeff and what it meant to him, how proud he was that there was not a cowardly drop of blood in the boy's body. He looked George right in the eye and told him he knew all the time who was coming up that bluff, and he had murdered the boy in cold blood. He called on his son Bill, wherever he was, whatever he might be doing, and however long it might take, to even the score with his father's murderers. Then he looked out across the intent faces of his listeners and saw Jim Truitt. He motioned Jim to come nearer, but Jim did not move. So he spoke to him, according to Granbury tradition, across the multitude. Jim, when you didn't have nothing but one pony and a wagon, didn't I take you in and feed you, didn't I? Jim made no reply. When you wanted to go to preaching, didn't I buy you the first suit of clothes that you ever had? Jim said nothing. Didn't I buy you a Bible, a good Bible, to start you out? Still Jim said nothing. It seemed to the sheriff that this had gone on long enough, and he drove the wagon out from under the gallows so that Nelson Mitchell swung back like a human pendulum and choked to death at the end of the rope.
Here we are at the Mitchell Bend Cemetery, and every good story comes to an end, and this is where the story ended for Cooney Mitchell, who we've been telling about his hanging and the gunfight that led up to his hanging. This is the gravesite of Jeff Mitchell. This was his son, who we talked about in an earlier episode, who was trying to smuggle the laudanum and the pistols up to his dad prior to the hanging. But this is where the story came to an end.
David, when did you first hear about the Mitchell-Truitt story, the Mitchell-Truitt Feud? How old were you, and where and why did you hear this?
Well, the first time I heard of it was when we at the Bridge Street History Center began planning to do something in the way of maybe having some meetings and our programs about the Mitchell-Truitt Feud, and I had never heard of it until that time. And
you're obviously you're Hood County native and been here all your life.
My parents
never talked about
parents
it.
or grandparents never talked about it, and they were here. Well, some of my grandparents were here when it was taking place. But you look at the events that happened following Cooney's hanging. Public opinion was really strong against the Mitchells when they hung Cooney. If you look at some of the newspaper articles that were written about the family, the Mitchells were called a gang of murderers that killed innocent people. And public opinion was really, really strong against them. But in time, and people, after Cooney made his speech to them before he was hung and said what he did about him being a good neighbor, taking care of his business, and he was awfully good to the Truitt family when we first found them. They were destitute. He took them in and provided them with everything they needed. And people began to think about what had happened. I think they changed their mind about the Mitchells, and I think in some cases they were really ashamed of what they did.
Right.
You look at when they finally caught up with Bill Mitchell and brought him back to Hood County. Bill's the one who did the shooting. At least that's what we think. And they tried him in Hood County for the murder of the Truitts and found him not guilty. And I think that reflects on the fact that they were trying to make up for what they thought they had done wrong with Cooney. Now, that's just my theory, but it certainly was a big change in the way things were going.
Could very well have been. And folks, we've got there's a book we have for sale there at the History Center called Outlaw. The story we've been telling is what took place here in Hood County. We've been taking you around, showing you the spots where this story happened. But what David's talking about, the Bill Mitchell story, we just covered the first half of it. The Bill Mitchell story took place out in New Mexico, Arizona, and it would make a great movie. It's a story in itself, so you'll just have to read the book to get that part of the story. But we hope you've enjoyed visiting all these sites. Roger, you have any closing comments?
Oh, I think we're good.
David?
The one thing that we didn't talk about Bill Mitchell, and it's part that really fascinates me, is his dad was hung because of the testimony of James Truitt.
Right.
His dad, before they hung him, asked the crowd to get word to his son so he could settle the score. Bill Mitchell rode his horse from New Mexico to East Texas and killed James Truitt and rode his horse back.
My goodness.
And they tried him out in East Texas and finally did convict him and for the murder of Mr. Truitt, sent him to hospital, but they turned him loose. He come home and never went back to prison. I mean, it's one of those kind of stories where the truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah, it's the truth. That's it. Well, thank you all for joining us on our adventure, and we may make a full-length movie out of this someday.